Okay, thanks everyone for coming here. I'm glad that I can present Balazs Bodo that recently got another ERC starting grant, but on blockchain and from a perspective from social sciences, which is kind of complementary to mine here. So I hope that this will not be the first time that we have him with us. Please.
Thank you very much, Samer, for organizing this. Thank you for coming. My name is Balazs Bodo. I'm a social scientist working at a law faculty at the University of Amsterdam. The institute that I'm working for is the Institute for Information Law, a leading research institute that deals with, it has been established 25 years ago to study issues like media regulation, intellectual property and copyright, data protection and privacy, more recently the regulation of personalizing agents and various algorithmic intermediaries. So it's a legal effort to shape policy around these issues, both in the Netherlands and also in Brussels on the European level. And a couple of years ago, they started to hire non-lawyers, non-legal researchers, such as me, because the institute understood that they need a better empirical understanding of what is happening in society, what is happening in technology, in order to formulate meaningful legal and policy recommendations. So they started to hire a number of non-legal expertise, economists, social scientists, and now we are working very closely with the legal researchers as empiricists, trying to design surveys, trying to design evidence-generating mechanisms with which we can have a first-hand quantitative insight into the processes in the information societies, so the policies that are formulated or thought about by the lawyers have an empirical basis. And a couple of years ago, I started to flag an issue for my lawyer colleagues. Pay attention, because something is happening in the computer science and cryptography field, which may have a serious impact on the legal domain, and that was blockchain, for a number of reasons. And this got to the point where in the same time when Samer won his ERC on blockchain, I also got funding from the same agency to study blockchain from a different perspective. And that is to study two things. First, the governance of blockchain technologies, certain blockchain applications, in order to understand how different layers or different components of this community self-organizes, to understand what are the potentials, what are the rules encoded in the community, encoded in the technology, how those rules are being made, how those rules are being changed, to understand the potential, the success and failure of a particular application. So that's one. The second is to study how particular applications go into and interact with particular social domains, how the copyright industry thinks about blockchain disruption, how data protection and privacy people think about blockchain applications, how supply chain management companies think about blockchain applications, how the state, how various parts of the government think about blockchain applications, to understand how people and institutions, when they face a potential emerging new technology, respond to that. And there is a gazillion ways this response can take form. They can reject, they can go with it, they can be enthusiastic, they can try to ignore it. But what is certain that without a closer understanding of these two processes, it's impossible to formulate sane policies. And that is the ultimate goal of the project, to feed this information from these two sub-projects into the legal and policy discourse, in order to avoid the trap that has, for example, copyright industries went through in the last 15 years, since Napster, due to the failure to understand peer-to-peer technologies, right? So this whole project comes from this understanding that if copyright lawyers understood peer-to-peer technologies better, they didn't try to do what they did or try to do in the last 15 years, and we could have somewhat avoided this copyright nightmare that has taken place, trying to regulate a technology which is very hard to regulate through top-down statutory means. Okay, so that's the spine of the project, and to zoom out a little bit on a more a conceptual level, what I would like to understand is what is technologically possible, what is that makes sense from all the technological possibilities on an individual level, what are people actually trying to see an opportunity to do with the technology, and whether people using the technology the way they use technology makes sense from a societal level. Right, and the current blockchain bubble or crypto bubble is a very good example to that. So there you can do a gazillion things with Bitcoin. People started to use it for speculation, but the speculation may not be the most beneficial use from a societal perspective, where people actually go into depth to speculate on cryptocurrencies. Right, so in that sense. That is how I would like to connect a technological understanding into a legal understanding through using social sciences. I won't go into the elements that I'm interested in the technology, because maybe we can return to that and maybe probably you are much more familiar with this. But I would like to focus on, I don't know how much time I have actually.
As much as you want. I mean, the slot is typically 1 hour, but feel free to, we can have more discussion, we can have more talk. We can extend further than the hour. It's very flexible.
Okay. Then I will go into that, because I'm curious. We are in the same tale with the 6 blind men and the elephant, right? Every different blind man touches a different part of the elephant, and they interpret it the same thing differently. So I'm showing you to show you what is important from the technology from my perspective. And maybe you will recognize the same technology, maybe you won't recognize the same technology. Both are interesting for me, so please say so. This is not what we think in terms of distributed ledger technologies. But for me, what is interesting is first the ability to tokenize any and everything, to have a digitally scarce representation of not just a financial vehicle or a financial investment instrument, but also a right within the copyright domain. You can actually tokenize the ability, the right to receive remuneration, receive money if someone uses a particular piece of work, or a ownership right of your house, of your car, of your whatever, or a piece of your identity. Anything can be represented as a scarce resource on a ledger. That's something noteworthy from a legal perspective, because very few things were actually in that status, and it makes a substantial fundamental. It may have a fundamental effect in law. for example, because there are certain things, very few things actually, that lawyers try to regulate as a type of property, a property which has a right against everyone else in the world. So if you have a right, ownership right on a piece of a land or a piece of a real estate, that right gives you the possibility and the power to exclude any and everyone across the world from that particular property. That's very different than, for example, a contractual obligation, where you can actually negotiate one-on-one with the other counterparty about the particular possibilities the other has. But in order to regulate something as a property, you have to have a register, a public list of who owns what. That's one of the key prerequisites to actually be able to regulate something as a property, that you are able to look up who owns what. And suddenly, tokenization enables us and lawyers and everyone in the society to build these public registries about who owns what, which suddenly transforms a number of so far differently regulated things into the possible domain of property. Okay, so this is why it's important for us from a legal perspective, that suddenly your personal data can be imagined as a type of property. Sometime suddenly this whole shift into licenses and licensing rather than selling stuff can be reversed and reimagined as a property. And I'm also very fascinated that after 20 years or more celebrating the digital revolution as an opportunity to get rid of scarcity, we suddenly celebrate a technology which recreated digital scarcity. So for me as a social scientist, this is fascinating, that suddenly we are celebrating digital scarcity. But who knows what will be the use of that. The distributed ledgers, I won't go into that. But there are a number of questions that will be important for us when we try to understand the public use or public perception of these distributed ledger technologies. And to give you an example, one of the questions is, who will want to store everything forever as a copy of a distributed ledger? What is the incentive for me to store on the Bitcoin ledger all your histories of buying drugs from Silk Road? Why would I want to put everything on the distributed ledger technologies? Or to rephrase it, what are the types of information that we all want to preserve or know for eternity? And then, what is the incentive for me to store it for eternity? Right? So in that sense, the technical promise of we all have a copy of the ledger and that's wonderful, needs to be qualified in a sense that, okay, that's the technical possibility, but what are my personal incentives or your personal incentives to store all kinds of information completely unrelated to you, with all the costs, with all the overheads, in order to achieve something? And as a society, what is the information that we want to forget? What is the information we want to preserve? And in what form? Again, this is what probably excites lawyers the most, because that's the most obvious inroads into the expertise domain of lawyers, smart contracts. And then again, the question is, again, what kind of human interactions we can automate without any problems, right? Because when I hear engineers talking about smart contracts, there is a hope, or there is an understanding from the engineering perspective that law can be formulated in if-then claims, and contracts are actually these. If you do something, then I will do something in return, and if you don't perform, then there is an escrow, and if we have if you only partially perform, then the counter performance will be only partial. And from the clear fact that it's relatively easy to automate relatively dumb transactions where we don't expect many things to go wrong, there is this extrapolation which many lawyers question, is that, yeah, but to what kind of complexity you can actually cover with smart contracts? Because ultimately, the whole legal system with its all complexity of lawmaking and democratic deliberation and the court system with the many layers of courts and remedies, it's a giant fail-safe which catches unquote errors in contracts, in human relationships. And the question is there this exception handling mechanism? To what extent this exception handling mechanism is still needed when you encode some level of complexity into the contract language? And what, again, I understand out of this, that even if you can automate like 80% of the transactions which are truly dumb, which truly don't need any complex exception handling, then you have done a lot, right? Facebook is sending trillions of messages in a month without human intervention, and there is a huge amount of messages which require human attention to understand if it contains nudity, if it contains hate speech, if it contains fake news, if it contains Russian propaganda, blah, 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 blah. But that's a very small percentage of all the messages Facebook automatically assigns to people. So they were able to efficiently automate the matching of people and messages, like 99% of the cases, and the remaining 1% is what is still handled with humans. If you can achieve that amount of automation in the legal sphere, that's huge, right? That's transformative. That doesn't make that 1% human attention redundant or unnecessary, but it certainly shifts power, shifts responsibilities, shifts how we organize. And in that sense, I will get back to that a little bit later. One of the questions that, again, we need to ask is if there is, through standardization, through smart contracts, through smart contract languages, through the required level of complexity, a way to automate and privately arrange transactions between me and you, or you and you, is this way of privately setting the rules between us superior to what we have now, that we are setting the rules of interaction through democratic processes and democratic institutions? Is private ordering of our societies inherently better than what we have now through this complex and messy and human and very, very dirty way of democratic politics, right? Again, for me, I find these claims fascinating. Disintermediation, that this is a disintermediated technology, which I don't think. But again, for me, one of the questions here regarding decentralization and disintermediation is what we are trying to get rid of, bypass through these technologies. What is the value of these institutions? Actually, what is the role that they are doing, and what is the value that they carry? Do they carry any value? If they are carrying trust, how much is that trust? Quantify it the way you want to. And whatever is being proposed as an automated algorithmic alternative, is it anything better? Does it offer the same services but only more efficiently? Or they are not completely overlapping, they are not completely compatible. And we are replacing one kind of an institution with a different kind of institution, but we are losing in that translation certain types of functions, certain types of affordances. And again, you know, I can talk a lot about copyright because I've been doing a lot of copyright and piracy studies. And I'm certainly not the person who is very much in favor of collecting societies who are often very corrupt, intransparent organizations, collecting huge amounts of money and then distributing or not distributing to rights holders. But if blockchain, copyright startups trying to disintermediate this whole process and cut the collecting societies out of the system, do we understand who they are cutting out? When others trying to cut the state and its identity registries out of the system, do they understand what is the role of those institutions before we cut them out? And with whom are we replacing? So how actually solid the claim of blockchains are disintermediated technologies when there is a very strong incentive to re-centralize certain resources like mining power around cheap energy sources, right? And if those cheap energy sources are in dictatorships, then is this a truly decentralized technology? And would you mind putting your personal data on an infrastructure that's under effective Chinese jurisdiction because of the mining power concentrated there? So politics, geography is a question when you start to dig deeper into this technology. And again, what are the different configurations impact on the actual affordances of the technology? What can an open source versus a closed source? This is very much getting where your ERC is, if I understand correctly, is focusing. How different configurations of humans and technologies actually create different types of opportunities or different types of possibilities for the application of the technology. Banks will be super happy to do the end of the day clearing of transactions between them on blockchain. But is that any different from any other database solution? Not that much, because you just have a different technological platform, but the actual governance of how that is organized and the regulation of how that is organized, it's not that much different from an Oracle database or from another approach. So the really interesting question is, for me at least, with the unpermissioned open version variant of this technology, which is, again, was designed with this aim to bypass regulation or be immune to regulation, and which is the most massive one in terms of stakeholders and incentives and uses and governance. And I'm really curious whether this technology actually survives and is able to achieve that level of organization where Linux or open source, certain open source projects or Wikipedia are at the moment, that they are able to govern planetary scale resources without major breakdowns and failures. Right? Because this is a planetary scale technology, and governing planetary scale technologies is not easy. Usually they are governed top-down military mechanisms. The railways, the first technology which spanned more than one time zone, is actually, there is a reason for all the railway employees to have a military uniform, and the reason is that this is a military organization, right? And you need a military organization to avoid catastrophes in a technology which spans, like the Trans-Siberian Railways, 8 or 9 time zones, right? So it's easier to have a military-style organization to govern those technologies. This is the complete antithesis of a military-style organization. Whether it flies or not, that's one of the questions I will be looking forward seeing. So this is what I see of this technology. This is my elephant as a blind man. And the questions, again, what I will be looking at is what kind of infrastructures and applications emerge and how they govern code, how they govern, how they are governed by code, and how they govern certain social human practices with the code. Second, how those different social domains deal with this technology, what do they understand of it, and how do they interpret it, how these technologies are interpreted by third parties for the state, for the copyright holders, for different parties. And you see that with the cryptocurrency. This is a super messy stuff. There are so many cheerleaders, outright cheaters, and bad faith actors in this domain. It's like very difficult to actually get a fully and well-informed insight into what this technology is capable of actually. Then this whole interpretation process of what is it that we are facing is a super interesting and super messy process, which you need to understand in order to see why the state does or does not invest with data, with resources, with grants and funds into that. And I think, I hope I won't offend you, that maybe the ERC won't be that generous next year or the year after with funding blockchain applications, simply because this hype will just disappear, and they're gonna also realize that this was more like a hype than a fundamental change, and we have to. It would be much more difficult to actually convince investors, whether public or private funders, to invest into the research of this technology, and you know, after that, what remains in the intersection of law and technology. Okay, so very quickly. Regarding the governance structures, again, I'm really interested in the governance of these unpermissioned open variant of the technology, and I will be looking at a number of questions following Ostrom's governance of commons, because I think it's ultimately a common shared resource, and the commons research identified a number of things that emerge necessarily through the conflicts and through the history of the commons, because they need answers. And I think that blockchain technology governance is at the very beginning of this, but as things like the DAO and the collapse and the growth and the collapse of the crypto market and the regulators entering are unfolding, there are going to be more and more answers to these questions, like do we have the clearly defined boundaries? Are we able to identify who is in and who is out, who is part of the decision-making process, who is not, who has what kind of responsibilities, rights to participate, and what are their, how their responsibilities are delineated, tasks differentiated. What are the decision-making procedures? How are decisions being made? How are they appealed? How they are contested? How they are negotiated, right? We are not seeing fully formed mechanisms to that, and there's a wide variety, a competition, if you like, a market for different approaches. I'm really curious which will be the most resilient to scale up, again, because doing it in a small scale, it's relatively easy. If you know all the people in the room, that's easy. If you don't know all the people in the room, that's more difficult. What are the mechanisms to actually hold people responsible for their actions? How you correct them, how you sanction certain types of behavior and correct certain types of behavior without reliance on the legal system, the police, the state powers of violence, monopoly. How do you resolve conflicts? And in that sense, conflicts may be, this hard fork is the more or less the only conflict resolution mechanism built into the system by design. It's not the best, maybe. So there needs to be. I expect other mechanisms to emerge. What is the external recognition of these governance mechanisms? right? So my previous research was the internal governance of file-sharing communities, pirate communities, and the problem was that they have built sophisticated governance structures that included also intellectual property protection rules, but they had zero external recognition, zero, and that spelled their doom. So what are the interfaces between the external regulatory frameworks and the internal ones there? And again, what is how uses, communities, technologies, governance models actually configured to solve a particular problem or serve a particular domain? I think that's the most important, because there is no universal rule. There is no one size fits all. I think in the terms of technology use or technology design, architecture, or its governance, they are all shaped by the particular conditions around them, legal conditions around them, social conditions around them, political conditions around them. Blockchain technology was shaped by this crypto-anarchist political approach, right? And I will show you something maybe later. Does this fit well into our European societies? Does this fit equally well with the Spanish society, as well as the Dutch society, as well as the Hungarian society? Maybe, maybe not. So that's the governance. These are the governance issues I will be looking at. And the other is the legal issues, so the external envelope around that, where I also have a number of questions. Some of them are strictly legal. Can you define in law? How do you define in law a smart contract? How do you define in law in a token? How do you define a law a distributed ledger? What is the relationship of the GDPR, the European Data Protection Regulation, to the publicness of the distributed ledger? Are they incompatible? How do you resolve the current apparent incompatibility? These are very, very gritty-nitty legal questions, and some of the lawyers, colleagues of mine, will be super happy to actually deal with them. Let's write in a preamble the definition of blockchain is the following, and then they will do that. Also, what are the issues that are, again, statutory requirements, oftentimes, of interoperability, of data portability, of portability of contractual negotiations, of the synchronicity of on-chain and off-chain information, right? So if there is a transaction, okay, so the Lithuanian state puts all its property registry on blockchain. That's great, right? This is a pilot that they do, and that will happen. So there is a transaction taking place on chain. Someone sells his apartment or her apartment for bitcoins, and there is a change in the registry. But the land registry, which is not switched off because they are still people who have a building, they have their jobs, they are doing they go to work every day, they forget to register this change because the people who engaged in the transaction didn't notify them. So there is an asynchronicity or a conflict between off-chain and on-chain registries. How do you resolve them? Where is the truth? Who says which is the truth? What is the role of the institution that we hope to disintermediate by blockchain? Are they the final ones saying that? And so on and so on. Also, how you can, what is the right mechanism to actually negotiate these rules or experiment with these rules? And what I see in financial regulation, that financial regulators, when they came to cryptocurrencies and exchanges and all these crypto service providers, what they said that, guys, we are watching you, but we create a regulatory sandbox. We claim authority over whatever you're doing, so you don't you dare to think that you are immune from the law. You belong to us, but we are not trying to kill you at the moment. Let's see how that works out. This is how we can create legal certainty for you, so you can grow. These are the rules for now. Maybe they will change as this whole market or this whole domain changes. we're gonna set up a body where we negotiate the rules all the time, and it's a sandboxing effort. Sandboxing not just in the technological sense, but also in the legal sense, that we set up rules to maintain that whatever happens in this sandbox does not wreak havoc and destroy the wider financial system, or does not create extra exposure for banks or for individual debt holders or whatnot. And the question is, this model seems to work really well. Can we replicate this model for other applications, for data or property-based applications, for copyright-based applications, where the public bodies who oversee a certain market or a certain type of activity create these regulatory sandboxes so the technology can grow and innovation can take place. Again, there is a second layer which still belongs to the domain of policy and law, and that is how do we represent particular national or societal level interests on blockchain. And I'm going back again to, I don't know if I have, so I don't know if you know about this event. It has taken place last week. Anarchopulco, that's the title, and it's the World Congress of Anarchists meeting in Mexico, and it's a very particular crowd which has a very, very, very strong aversion towards the state. They don't want the state to interfere with their rights. They are in the political, extreme libertarian corner of this universe. What's interesting here was that Ron Paul has given a keynote there. Okay, but it's also the Bitcoin Jesus was here. And this whole event was sponsored by Bitcoin.com. Okay, so it's not a random event of some fools who want to live with their guns alone in their huts in the frontier and exchange bitcoins. This is a very particular political ideology sponsored by Bitcoin.com, and it's not an accident. It's by design, right? So is this something that we're going to buy into in the Netherlands? I ask from my Dutch colleagues who are the devil for these crowds. Like the Dutch socialist state is the worst case that can happen to these people. So the question is, when the Dutch state starts to invest into cryptocurrencies or blockchain technology, what is the ideology they are buying? And also, is there a way to represent the Dutch or the Spanish or the Hungarian societal values and interests and priorities and preferences into a technology which is often seen as neutral, but this neutrality only is there to hide the anarcho-political ideology? Again, how do you regulate this technology in the European level? And when it comes to regulation, think of regulation as maybe you know, because you know more about that. It's like, why are like so many ships on the high seas sailing under a certain country's flag? It's Liberia. All of the ships I see are running under Liberian flag. There is something in the maritime regulation of that particular country, which incentivizes ship owners to register their ships under that particular jurisdiction. The same with offshore accounts and banking and taxation. There is certain types of regulation which incentivizes companies to register in their holdings in Delaware or in the Isle of Man or in some Caribbean offshore tax paradise. right? So when it comes to Europe, the question for me is like, what is the regulatory environment which incentivizes key intermediaries in this ecosystem, like miners, for example, to register under European legislation rather than Chinese or American or Canadian, right? What is the right framework where people who run mining rigs want to bring their rigs into Iceland under European jurisdiction rather than Guangxi? The price of the energy is the same, and I rather have my personal data if it gets shared on the blockchain infrastructure in an infrastructure where miners are located in a jurisdiction I'm familiar with. Right? And in that sense, what is the level of regulation that we are willing to give up in order to incentivize these intermediaries and stakeholders to use a certain type of legislation rather than another one? And finally, very high-level questions, which are also part of the legal thinking, because these are the ones that guide certain normative solutions. This should be like this. This is what the law does, right? This should be like this. And in that sense, we also need to find answers like, what is trust ultimately? And how do we govern trust? How do we make sure that only the good guys are trusted? How do we build mechanisms where there is an incentive to distrust distrustful people? How do you create the information channels where you can actually assess whom to trust? What is the right mechanism to create trust? Right? I don't trust at the moment any of these infrastructures because of the miners being in China. Should I trust still the algorithm that it will not be, it's able to overcome this limitation of the Chinese miners? Again, with the anarcho-pulco, what are the values that I'm subscribing to when I subscribe to using a technology? What is the trade-off between democratic rulemaking and private ordering through smart contracts? How we reframe our understanding so we don't try to assess these technologies with the old, often stale and sometimes outdated conceptual frameworks, right? Copyright was the prime example. Copyright is based on exclusivity. Peer-to-peer does not. The digital technologies do not allow exclusivity. Therefore, peer-to-peer technologies are bad, right? This conceptual change that digital technologies and exclusivity are not fully compatible, so you have to give way and release, let go exclusivity, didn't happen in copyright. And that was a very costly mistake. We need to think how to avoid those mistakes. And again, decentralization, right? How do we actually engineer decentralization into the architecture so there are no re-centralization incentives, or there is an effective way to counter re-centralization of certain resources in the hands of the few, because that then kills the whole point, right? If mining pools are able to centralize very quickly and effectively, then the fundamental promise is broken. So, and again, this is my last point. How do you future-proof this? Maybe blockchain is not the right technology. It's a fad. Maybe it's just it's a niche which won't have major societal. But the questions that it raises are valid, right? The questions about decentralization, the questions about values, the questions about governance, the questions about the interface between humans and technology are valid questions. We need to future-proof somehow this whole blockchain discourse in order to detach it from a technology which may have a shorter life cycle than a hamster, right? These technologies often live shorter than a pigeon or a hamster. And we at the universities are in the business of connecting dead people with unborn people. This is the point of the whole university, is to network the dead with the unborn. How do we do we bridge these two time scales, one short term and one really long term intergenerational? and how we bridge these, how we build these bridges between faculty of informatics and computer sciences, a faculty of law, a faculty of social sciences. So we have the same language, we have the same vocabulary, and when you say IP, I know that you're referring to internet protocol and not intellectual property, and we are actually able to understand our concerns and identify what are the shared concerns about this, and where we need to build closer cooperations. So that's more or less the next 5 years for me. I don't know how to. I know where to start. I don't know how to solve, but it's going to be a fun travel, and I hope to be engaged with you with this project and with the wider you, with the discipline that you represent, because now it's often framed as a competition. It's you or us, right? It's the technology or the state, and I don't think that's the right way to frame it. It's you and us, and it's us, and that we can only do together. So thank you very much. Yeah.
More than a question, is a comment. And, I was happily surprised about the use of principles of Ostrom in the governance, because that's precisely what we have been working the past weeks. I think we share a similar line. We started some month ago with the literature review on the governance, and we share similar view that says that at least what we have found for the moment is either very libertarian, like techno-determinists or neoliberal views, where it's market-driven, based on fostering individualism, this kind of views. And then there's other part, which is more kind of trying to reinforce current central institutions, so we've seen technology, so we have that. And we actually are trying to start this idea of, can we bring the literature of the commons into the governance with blockchain? So definitely, hopefully we'll have a lot of
that's so good to hear.
Yes. More than a question, because then my question was about methodology regarding this. I mean, Ostrom's principles is an example where I was reading yesterday a paper from Primavera, and I was here on the idea of bringing the cooperative principles from Sols into the governance of blockchains as well. So more than a question, maybe it's a reflection, but how are you planning to methodologically, I saw it was one of the questions in your last slide, because we're willing to collaborate with this as well. Like, what is your methodology, or what are you planning to do methodologically in order to explore these questions? For example, we were thinking the other day about this idea of in-chain, off-chain, and what kind of rules are better to be encoded in chain. All of them, maybe some of them they are not at all better. Just to give you an example, but we're thinking on cases of that. I don't know, but I think we need a lot of empirical work on this. And I was wondering, what is your methodological approach towards this?
Yeah. So actually, yesterday was the deadline for the job calls for this project, and I hope to recruit. I really hope that at least a few of the applicants are from one of these communities, and whom I can ask to actually be part and do participant observation, or just work on any or some of these projects, and have a first-hand account of what is happening there. Because what I see is that. So my approach to this is that so this is a bottom-up process, and it's very difficult to actually do anything with it from the top down. So yeah, I'm part now on a committee for the International Standard Organization on blockchain governance. Does it make any sense? No, it doesn't make any sense, because ISO can say this is the standards now for blockchain governance, and what? Right? So the question is how these structures emerge from the bottom up, And these structures emerge through conflicts. So my approach to this is to map the conflicts as they unfold and see how they are resolved or remain unresolved, what kind of outcomes they produce in the short and in the long term. And luckily, this scene is very rich with conflicts, very fundamental conflicts, from the DAO to the size debate. So there are a number of unresolved issues here and there, and how these technical, seemingly superficial, on a superficial level, technical conflicts translate into more fundamental conflicts of value and governance are what I would like to understand better. I hope to have someone on the field, but working with those documents that are available, the discussions, the decisions, the arguments, pro and con, the outcomes, the forks, the failed forks, the votes, is somehow I would like to map and tick off the boxes if it's possible that this is okay. Now this is now solved. Now we find to this question an answer somewhere on conflict resolution or on accountability or on remedies or on external applications.
That's a good question because that's related to the governance of, let's say, like blockchain.
Yeah.
Are you planning to explore as well, like cases where, let's say, it's a cooperative, where it's a pre-production community, where they actually use blockchain technologies as a platform of collaboration, and then explore those governance as well, or just those related to the, let's say, the governance of the blockchain technology themselves?
Yeah, so that's the second point. So,
okay.
Yeah. But again, how different social domains or different actors decide to experiment with the blockchain depends on also the internal characteristics of that, right? So it goes hand in hand. It makes very little sense to look at a cooperative without understanding what are their technological choices. Why did they choose Ethereum chain versus why did they choose something that the tool set that you are working on or are planning to do work on versus something else that's being developed in Germany or in the electronic frontier somewhere in Anarchopulco. So yeah, absolutely.
Hello. I would like to thank you for the talk and for the approach that you are taking about trying to understand the technology before setting the law, because as you say, with the copyright we have had that amount of misconceptions about how the technology works. So there may be unexplainable things in the laws, and I would like to point to, for example, BitLicense, which was a regulation that was imposed in New York State on 2014. That it's one of the interesting things about the regulation in Bitcoin. It was the first state in the United States that put it as a regulation. And an interesting thing was that in the Bitcoin community there was that rejection to regulations for one side, but also it is interesting because in the BitLife there was a lot of interest in making that regulation good. In the original regulation there was no distinction between, I don't remember, but the use of Bitcoin and maybe I come to that later. Sorry, I just lost the point. Just I like the approach of embracing that technology instead of trying to limit it. You are talking about smart contracts and how that can be applied to law, and how can we make that if you own a property, you can make a statement that if you own the property in the blockchain and I transfer that property to somebody else, I'm actually transferring it, and that must be a how is that called? Something that is written in the law.
That has to have a legal recognition. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, just thank you for taking that approach. And also, as I was saying, in the Bitcoin community, I come from that space, from the open source, hacker, Bitcoin space. And in 2014, there was that kind of problem in the Bitcoin space, that there was that Bitcoin Foundation that was trying to talk with the states and talk with the group that it was a kind of actor that was trying to regulate Bitcoin in some way and make that easier. But
it's now defunct, right?
Yeah, because it had not that legitimacy. My point is, the Bitcoin community from the beginning has been trying to provide a solution for the problem that we have with the Visa and MasterCard knowledge about what is happening in the world. Sorry, it is difficult for me to speak in English and articulate all my arguments. We have, it's not actually a question, it's, we are in a debate. Okay, it is okay, no? It's,
absolutely,
it's like, yeah. We had that, with guys, we had that anonymity, and with Visa and MasterCard, if we had no guys, Visa and MasterCard now knows when Putin is taking a beer in a bar. And Putin cannot do anything about that, because even if in Russia they try to set a law, the servers are in the United States and the data is there. And we only have those two big companies for managing credit cards. And Bitcoin is a solution for that. Cryptocurrencies is a solution for that. For retaking the privacy of the guys. Then also, sorry, about the Anarchists that you commented, Richard is not actually a representative of the Bitcoin community. There are not as issues there. There are a lot of people talking about Bitcoins, and actually there is all that movement of, sorry, it is quite important to understand that there are not individuals, but that's right, that there is all that cypherpunk movement that doesn't like that regulation, and in the other sense, it is also important to regulate well Bitcoin and do not avoid people to do things that it is not. Sorry.
Go.
Maybe in the yeah, we can talk later.
Hmm?
I think that it is difficult to articulate all the thoughts I have. No, just don't worry. Don't worry.
One of the properties you were talking about was the tokenization, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What are your thoughts on the, because this is something as a researcher I'm personally very concerned, the idea of an extreme commodification. Like if we end up in a world, again thinking of reproduction communities and things like that, where everything is tokenized, everything is quantified. What are your thoughts on this risk on a possible extreme commodification as a result of the use of this?
It's interesting because the discourse around technology is always focused on extreme scenarios, right? So when and if already built into the assumptions, right? So what I read from people from TAPSCO to Primavera, what I see is that we assume that the old system will be switched off and everything will be transacted on the blockchain. So all the property will be on, and that never happens, right? There are no simple, not even in computer science, there are no systems that are just simply switched off and a new system. I think this is what I see is like most of the problems that computer scientists need to solve is maintenance of legacy systems which are there and need to interface with layers and layers and layers of new systems. This is the nightmare that I see, at least. So it's never so simple like that. I don't think that there will be ever in the lifetime of the next 10 human generations a system where everything will be commodified. That's not the problem. The problem is how we live together in a hybrid situation where some things are being treated as a standardized property with a digital representation, and some others are not, and in some places more, and in others less. And this is the friction. This creates the friction, right? That makes it that creates all the problems. These incompatibilities, this lack of interfaces, these problems of migrating from one system to another. If you come to the Netherlands, right, the whole country is based on there is no cash, and everyone uses locally issued Maestro cards, and they don't accept MasterCards, right? This country lives off Amsterdam's tourism, but they don't accept only Maestro. That's the problem, right? The system is working. The cashless system works perfectly well for the Dutch and only for them. And if you're a tourist, you're fucked. And this I see as the major problem with other technological systems as well. Is these sometimes super long eras of transitions where legacy systems need to somehow be synchronized and harmonized with the new approaches. And the building of these interfaces is as important as building the infrastructure of the new one.
This is maybe more for a debate we can discuss later, but I mean, I agree in the idea of like the extreme idea of commodification might be, but personally I am concerned of how, for example, if we start tokenizing certain, I'm talking more about especially about the reproduction community and things like that. What is that affecting the dynamics of the community? Because maybe people stop being, altruistic. They just start gaming the system. So in a more macro level, I agree that sometimes, however, we have cases like the social system of China, social credit system, things like that. So still, personally, I believe we have to be aware. But I was wondering more on we can debate later.
On
the impact of certain communities, which
And that's, to give you an example that we are thinking now, working on with a colleague, is like when it comes to copyright registries, right? What is the thing that you tokenize? You can tokenize things in copyright, right? This is the work, the book written by Samer. He owns the copyright, he owns the rights of translation, he has given the right of print publications to a publisher, the university press, somewhere, but we can represent that in the token. And we can do that, we need to do that at one point because it's completely madness that we don't have that yet as a public. But then should again we tokenize public domain works? Just to create a representation and say this work is in the public domain. So that's the only flag bit that needs to be set. This has no rights associated, and that for the copyright lawyers, this is an unimaginable thing because the whole point of the public domain is that there is no property right attached. They are not under the law. They are not covered by the law. But what we see is that there is a problem that people are trying to encroach upon the public domain and try to privatize the public domain one way or another. So is registration, tokenization a nice way to actually put something, claim something as a digital token so others cannot claim it? It's the same with the patents, right? Technology patents. There are many technology patentees which only claim patents so no other company can privatize it, and they release the patent for free, right? So people can actually use them without a patent troll claiming it. So yeah, I don't see a predefined path where a certain type of technological capacity would necessarily lead to a particular outcome. But this is the whole point of this, is that if we see that you cannot, you know that much better than I do. It's like you cannot predict the future of a a probabilistic system. Then what do you do? And there is a really nice work by Manuel de Landa, Philosophy and Reason. It's like you can identify maybe the tendencies within a system, the attractors that drive the properties of this, the development of the properties of the system. And if we can identify, and that's the point of this whole process, if we can identify that because there are strong attractors, private interests, that are pulling the system into a certain tendency, drive the system towards certain tendencies, penalize certain outcomes and reward others, which make certain outcomes a higher probability than others, then we can say, okay, maybe we just need to pay attention to this and try to influence that one way or another. I don't know what in that particular case would be the best, in order to like steer the development of a system into a slightly different direction.
Just to switch a little bit the debate. You started at the beginning talking about the relationship between blockchain and society, focus on different topics. I wonder if, so far, most of the examples that you show, they intend to transform the way that we did things and see them from the blockchain perspective, like replacing things, reducing obstacles, and so on. But what new things that can be imagined with blockchain? I mean, how can it really transform the society beyond reducing obstacles? For instance, to know who owns something. Like I read that in Japan they have real problems to know who owns the land because of the regulations. So that's okay, they can solve the problem, but it is really going to create some new uses and additional customs and so on.
Yeah, I read lots of science. I love science fiction. So there are the possibilities are endless. So AI is engaging in transactions with each other. I don't know if you read I Am Bank's Culture series. I love these are smart AIs running the world there, I can imagine. There is also another book which I really love that's called Accelerando, and you know that. So that is this space, right? This is what takes place. But what I think, that's my prediction. Maybe I'm completely wrong. But this particular type of technology, I expect them to be very relevant in machine-to-machine interactions. Not that much as humans to humans, or machines to humans, as much as machines to machines, because it's a technology of standardization, right? It's a machine of standardized interactions, standardized transactions. And standardization is it's a super important process that has driven the modernity since the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution has started, the change from handmade stuff into machine-made stuff, which made things interoperable, measurable, quantifiable, from the raw materials up to your hourly wage. Everything. From production, through distribution, through sales, through labor and human relations. Standardization.
Let's take an example that may not be the case. Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about Twitter, you can hypothesize about its contribution to great knowledge. We can debate about it. But I think that the creators never expected to be that Twitter could be used to organize traffic there. I remember the crisis of the Hayakuku, this volcan that erupted and disrupted all the air traffic across Europe. And only it was possible to know what was going on or what to do because certain people started writing tweets about current status, alternatives, and so on. So Twitter was not the best for this, but it turns out that in a certain situation it could provide a solution. And I'm wondering, blockchain has the same. What if you could tokenize love, for instance? Say, I have only a limited amount of love in my life, and I want to give it to certain people. So, can blockchain help me to organize this?
But love, unfortunately, is not scared. Well, it's one of the not scared.
You're still depends on it what's
Okay, so I skip through this slide. Your question is very valid, and when I talked to I used this slide for when in the TU Delft, the Technical University Delft, they opened a blockchain lab. That's computer science, and I entertained. There was a room full of engineers, so I entertained them with this patent, and maybe you can find out what that is. That's actually an apparatus which helps the delivery of a baby through the centrifugal force, and it was designed by a mining engineer who have seen in the Brooklyn Zoo an elephant giving birth and spinning around its vertical axis, and it's like, I understand, the elephant is spinning around her axis because she wants to spin the baby out of, and that's a way to actually exercise force in a nice manner. And why don't we just help human women to deliver babies without the pushing and without all the force, and just spin her around, put a thing with which you can catch the baby, and then it's all solved. Okay?
Does it work, or
it's a U.S. patent. It's a U.S. patent. It's a U.S. patent. It's a U.S. patent. It's from the patent application, and it has been granted. So the question is, how do you distinguish between a great idea from an engineering perspective, which grants patent protection, from an actual sense that people want to use it? So your question is I've seen blockchain applications which try to put on the blockchain your sexual history, so you can actually trust another person not to be a rapist, right? So it's a market. we engage in a sexual relationship and we mark each other like he was good, he was nice. But do you really want to do that? It makes sense from a certain perspective, but whether that you will find women who will actually sit into that construction, that's a different question. And that's a huge step, right? A huge valley, uncanny valley that you have to cross between socially, and that's the individually sensible application, and doesn't say anything whether that individual is actually in its right mind, because it makes socially sense to do so.
Also evolves. I mean, I couldn't share pictures of my personal life in the internet, as my younger colleagues does. So it's a matter also of what society you were brought into. So,
yeah, but again, in that sense, it's very difficult to predict the actual uses of an emergent system. And you quoted Twitter. Well, it now becomes more and more apparent that Twitter is very easy to manipulate, and it's very. We need to renegotiate what is our trust vis-a-vis the information we receive through Twitter. Because it's very hard for the individual to say whether the information is being put there by a bot, and whether that's bot controlled in Moscow or in Beijing or in Brussels or in the UK, and whether that's by a state actor or a political party, whether that's malevolent or benevolent, and the infrastructure is not helping you with that trust negotiation, because its interest is pointing into a different direction. So in that sense, it's again not that easily predictable whether there won't be a strong incentive to actually hijack the system or break down the system by certain actors, or just appropriate the system by. And what is your response to that? That's the question, like, always, right? Is the answer to the machine in the machine, or do you need external mechanisms to actually make sure that that bad things don't happen? And that's the discussion that we are having now with social media. Where is the answer to the problem of the machine, the problem of trust generate in the machine? Does Facebook need to solve that? Twitter need to solve that? The legislators have to step in, or individuals will just say, okay, I'm not dealing with these guys anymore because it's such a massive thing. What are the mechanisms that produce the answers? And I don't, the emergence of these mechanisms.
Maybe it even doesn't matter. I mean, trust, like intelligence, is in the eye of the beholder. So as long as you trust someone, doesn't matter what they tell about this person. We are seeing this with the presidents of the United States. So who cares? I mean, for who is important trust, and under what conditions? Depending on the social group you belong to, maybe you trust what your colleagues do, but if other people tell you really the truth, objectively the truth, you may not trust this because they don't belong to your group. So this is it has been proven through several experiments. So I don't think that trust in this context is such a valuable asset. But in any case, I understand the concern about fake news and all this, but it has existed forever. Maybe what happens today is that the access we have to information is so huge, and everything happens so fast that what in the past happened along years, now we are suffering in a few weeks, critical weeks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
You said that blockchain allows us to over-tokenize things like identity, nationality. So if a token can be sold, it can possibly emerge a black market about identity and such things. So is there a limit to tokenize something? Can we draw a line about what can be tokenized or what cannot be? And who can determine that line?
I would rephrase the question. I would say, what are the conditions of tokenization, right? Is it enough that we have a technological opportunity to tokenize an identity and put my biometrics as a digital representation on a shared ledger, right? Or that's in itself not enough, because we have to find an answer to the what if question of what if I lock myself out of this identity? What is the fail-safe there? Or what if my identity gets hacked and stolen? What are my recurses? And these are not, some of these questions are probably can be answered by better escrow mechanisms and shared keys and whatnot. Some require the law to be able to say, a court, a judge being able to say, you have been hacked, we invalidate the transactions associated after, right?
Yeah, but the problem in a blockchain is that you cannot invalidate the Bitcoin someone has received. A court can say, okay, this Bitcoin, this transaction is invalid, but the person can buy things with that money. And even worse, you can publish some data that is, I don't know, a naked picture that is not authorized in the blockchain, and this is permanent and it will be there forever. And even if a judge says, and it can be done anonymously, a judge can say, okay, this transaction has information that should not be shared, and that will create this trace and effect. But I don't, the technology creates.
But you have to remind me, why do you claim that that things cannot be undone? Like for me, the DAO hack and how it was handled means that if enough people vote for a particular outcome, then some transactions can be undone, reverted. So it's not immutable. It is
not undone in the Ethereum Classic. It is still there.
Yeah.
Just a major part of the community goes in another direction.
Yeah, but that means that it has been, so certain transactions have been undone because of the will of a certain part of the community. So I don't know what really. So I hear people talking about immutability and stuff like that, but I don't. But I see in the practice that this is not true.
It was right?
Also the DAO example, I think it's not so reproducible as, like for example, recently with other like parity examples, like I don't know. It was much more difficult to compare because there was no these 28 days of hunting or freezing the assets like in the DAO, which this allows like some time for discussion. But when the money is stolen, it's spent, and other transactions depend on this, and after a few days, this is already a mess to go back. So it's actually, the immutability is actually an issue. It is actually pretty immutable. Don't you think so? I mean, at least with a high, I agree that it's not quite black and white, but still, it has a point.
Well, it's for me the DAO hack is not about the actual immutability of the ledger. It's about the immutability of the claim of immutability. Okay, so there at that point there was a consensus that this is an immutable record, and after that point, that consensus is broken, and now we are able to imagine different technological configurations. Under some of them, the ledger is immutable. Under others, pending certain conditions, the transactions can be reverted, and they get reverted. So there is, rather than having a single point with no dimensions, we now have a scale where we have a number of different imaginaries, right?
I'm happy to say that to make something that was recorded in a ledger, to change that, the cost of changing that are huge in many levels when considering
and now,
them in a
and you're very right. And now the question becomes the following: if as you say, the cost of reverting certain transactions is very high, while the risk of bad transaction is also high, that might create a hurdle in the application or the distribution of this technology. If that is the case, so if people don't start to sign up for this technology because of this double risk of getting frauded and not being able to have a real remedy, then people will start to, people like you will need to think about how do we assure that people have similar recourses against financial fraud as the financial system currently allows. Because these are trade-offs. So Visa, you may not like Visa for a number of reasons, but you can always get your money back, right? And that's a trade-off. And I, as an individual, rather have my money back if it gets stolen than not being able to use my Visa card to donate to Wikipedia, because I will solve it in another manner, right? So the question is how these incentives are stacked against the technology, and what is the incentive that moves toward this whole system towards adoption, right? And maybe the immutability is a feature that slowly turns into a bug unless there are other ways to handle fraud, for example.
Probably is one of the most important not features but characteristic of a blockchain. If I have a distributed system for payments, that when somebody pays me, nobody assures me that this payment will not be undone. Probably a decentralized system for payment doesn't make sense. That's why immutability is so strong in blockchain. I don't know if it's a huge debate, and I think it's interesting, but probably I will not be interested in a blockchain for payments or for other important transactions that need immutability that is not immutable. So
yeah, and some people are willing to take that risk. Apparently, a large amount of Ethereum developers and miners and stakeholders were not willing to take that risk. And it will see which is it's now a market rather than a dogma.
Yeah.
Right?
Also, if I try to focus now in just one idea, and that's all. About the right license. It was a license that was given in New York to people who were trustworthy. I don't know if it is still there or not. And one of the interesting things is that the first virtual currency business activity, which is the thing that is you are awarded of, you are able, you have the license to do a certain amount of things with Bitcoin and your customers. There was a pitfall that was that there was no claim about the development or dissemination of software at the first Bitcoin license. So the people in New York was saying, but can I develop in open source and cryptocurrencies and all that stuff, or I need a Bitcoin license? So that the license wasn't recognizing that in the first version, but later on, with the feedback of the people, it was included that Bit license doesn't include development. It's just for carrying on transactions with clients and certain amounts of money. And this is important to. This is why I say that it's very important to understand how is the technology working, and this is why I like that you are taking that approach, because with the copyright there are very huge mistakes there.
Yeah, but that's what my lawyer colleagues tell me, is that we don't regulate technologies, we regulate social practices. And that's, in that sense, what the underlying technology is is indifferent. It doesn't matter, or it only matters in a sense of what kind of social practices that we haven't seen before they enable, right? So mostly the question that we ask first is like, is this something new, or we can fit it into what has been before? And the problem with copyright and file sharing or peer-to-peer was that they thought, we have seen that before. We are able to regulate that like we regulated DRM. And it turned out that no, it's not. It's something new. But it's not new because of the actual peer-to-peer decentralized exchange of information. It's new because it did away with exclusivity and included a number of individuals, stakeholders into the domain of copyright regulation who weren't even mentioned there, and that's you and me, who are not authors but consumers, right? So in that sense, that was what's new that they missed. And for me, the question is always, for this, what is new? What is new in the sense that does it bring in new stakeholders that are not covered by the current regulations, or does it create new issues that are completely out of how we organize stuff so far? And we'll see whether that's, for example, because that's the immutability question. It's a super strong friction point. Because if I hold a gun to your head and say, you sell me your house, then you can go to the court and say, no, I was forced, that doesn't apply. And the court will say, yeah, you're right, here are your keys to your house.
Yeah, but the house is something that is off-chain, but bitcoins are on-chain, and even if a court says, okay, that are your bitcoins, the other guy says, okay, the court says, your bitcoins, I will spend them anyway.
And now you see this court case with Craig Wright, right? It's like around who owns those bitcoins. He controls the private key, and now there is a probably false contract in front of a court, and that is the major issue now. It's like, how do you resolve that conflict, that there are false contracts in real life and someone is controlling a private key?
It's huge. This is one of the things Primavera studied, right? Of how these ex-ante conditions and how these contracts in law, they are to there is a judge who will consider every case in a situation, and when we deal with technology, the technology decides, and maybe it's not fair. Maybe I say something to vote for a political party with a gun or to sell the house like this.
Actually, we may not need revertibility. We might just need upgradability of the contracts.
Maybe, yeah.
And that's possible in the smart contract context.
Yeah.
We don't want to revert the blockchain.
Yeah.
No, in Bitcoin,
we need
you can just switch to Ethereum.
Yeah, of course. If we forget the old blockchains and we stick to Ethereum,
or you just give a private key to the state so they can actually intervene, right? That's
it can be encoded. Yeah, that's right. It can be encoded in a smart contract. We don't need
I think it's already after 1 hour 25 minutes. I think we can bring this to an end. I think it was super interesting. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being part.